Hello there, everyone. It is Christy. It is Sunday, and so it is time for Weekend Winters, and I am running a little bit late this morning. Well, now afternoon. I was doing a lot of prep beforehand, and so, yeah, I'm having kind of this is my last day on holiday, so I'm feeling, I guess, not too stressed out about anything at all. So I hope you're doing well wherever it is, whenever it is you are, and that you had a lovely New Year's. I had an amazing New Year's Eve playing Dungeons & Dragons. DMing a session of dinosaur races, which will go down in my memory as one of the most hilarious D&D sessions in which I've ever participated. And if you want to hear people fall off their dinosaurs repeatedly and use dirty tricks to do PC versus PC like acts of violence, you can go check that out on my other channel. But anyway, I'm still setting up here mostly because I spent the morning listening for my sins. I spent my morning listening to more of King Crocoduck's video on social constructs. And we're gonna go, I was hoping to kind of move beyond it. I know a lot of people said that they enjoyed the very nerdy educational session we had last time. I was kind of ready to be done with it. But apparently, King Crocoduck gets all kinds of mad. Hello, Andrew. Gets all kinds of mad when anybody ever criticizes him ever, apparently. And gets like, so I found this out because in his Discord or something, he had asked people to try to find out what textbooks I had used during my courses at university to study statistics, because he wanted to like check up on my statistics knowledge. So the person who approached me, I sent them the link to the lecture slides I wrote myself when I taught research methods and statistics, including but not limited to multiple forms of descriptive and inferential statistics, descriptive statistics such as just normal like frequency, distributions, cross-tabulations, and how to interpret chi-squares and measures of association, principal components analysis, and correlation, and other forms of inferential statistics such as ordinary least squares regression, logistic regression. What else is on there? I don't know if I did time science. I used to teach a little bit of time series, but time series is very complicated, and a 10-week or 20-week course is not good for that. But there was all kinds. So yes. Like, I didn't use the textbook. I was the textbook. Like, I wrote the notes, and then my students used them to study for the exams. So we'll see. Apparently, he's very motivated to make a video criticizing me. I did point out in this reply as well that his checking into my understanding of statistics doesn't change the fact that he hasn't argued convincingly or at all that science isn't a social construct. He's so mad. He's got all of the mads about being refuted about his science being a social construct, and so apparently he's got to have to go trying to dig up dirt on me or whatever. So Ali says, Christy, I have a question. So I guess I should show you guys the screen. I haven't popped anything on there yet, so there'll be a kind of an empty space, but I have a question. Would you say that logical positivism is still a dominant philosophy on the natural sciences? Now, that's an interesting question because that is an area, and here's where I and King Crocoduck differ. I don't really feel that I'm qualified. I don't know that actually philosophy comes up much during the natural sciences. To be honest, I think that that's part of the problem with the natural sciences, is that they don't tend to do a lot of philosophy. I mean, if you want to talk about their underlying assumptions, and let's go ahead and like look up logical positivism so we can be working with a common definition. Is this coming up now? Yes. As I said, I'm still setting up as I'm broadcasting. Never a good idea. Let me do my setup a little bit better so I can see what I've got on the screen. That's perfect. All right, so let's look up logical positivism just so everyone has a working definition. Yep. All right. So it is located within philosophy in terms of, no, continue to cite. Yes, I accept your cookies. This is gonna, all right. And to be honest, I mean, in my opinion, logical positivism was it was a valid step. You know, it's like I actually have a lot of sympathies for. Sorry, I'm still setting up, as I said. The approach of the logical positivists and their attempts to advance scientific knowledge, and they were working in a different time with different concerns. Sorry, I will get this sorted out. I'm just picky about how much headspace I have here. Right. Philosophical movement that arose in Vienna in the 1920s. I'm also going to move my mic up, so sorry for this noise. That was ugly. Characterized by the view that scientific knowledge is the only kind of factual knowledge and that all traditional metaphysical doctrines are to be rejected as meaningless. It is important to understand that logical positivism rose as a sort of contrapoint or push against Hegelianism and a lot of the continental philosophy that was being practiced at the time. And I'm not, and this is why I have some sympathy, because I think that there's when you're talking about science, it is important. I'm really sorry about this, guys. Are you getting sick yet? I keep doing it the wrong way for some reason. I want to turn it. There we go. Oh, you stupid microphone. Not microphone. See, I have not had enough coffee today. We're just going to leave it there. Good. Good. Not so much rejecting the social sciences. So the logical positivists were interested in finding language or identifying language that could be considered meaningful. And this is where they got into a little problem philosophically. So let's just statements of meaning and then statements that are meaningless. So yes, only scientific knowledge is the only kind of factual knowledge, and all traditional metaphysical doctrines are to be rejected as meaningless. So logical positivism differs from early forms of empiricism, which is to be grounded in the idea of observation, right? Empirical things that we can see, observe, document around the world, and positivism. And here they're saying Hume and Mack, but I usually associate positivism with Mill, if I'm remembering everything correctly. And that is what we can say and be positive about about the world. So it's not a positive as in perspective. Comte, yes. If you go through my notes, you'll see Comte in there. But I also remember someone else developing it a bit more. But maybe that's just me misremembering my notes because I haven't taught it in like 10 years. Systematized science of sociology. And it's the idea that yes, can you, oh, you're rubbish. All right, let's look up positivism in Wikipedia. What we can positively say about the world. Positivism. Right, the philosophical theory which states that genuine knowledge, that is, knowledge of anything which is not true by definition, so not a priori, is exclusively derived from experience of natural phenomena and their properties. Thus, information derived from sensory experience as interpreted through reason and logic forms the exclusive source of all certain knowledge. Positivism therefore holds that all genuine knowledge is a posteriori, or after the fact knowledge. Right. So it's not about a positive as in a happy. They don't mean positivism in that way. They're talking about what can be known with certainty. Oh yeah, John Stuart Mill. See, I knew. I'm still drifting off the screen. So is that going to help? I think that helps a bit. Yes. Cool. All right. Right, so it holds that metaphysical doctrines are not false but meaningless, and the people that they're really kind of targeting their criticisms at are the Hegelians at this point. So the Vienna Circle, I'm going to go down to the second paragraph. Okay, all right, yes. So it's actually important to talk about this because the Vienna Circle was very much concerned with language. And this is an important part of maybe before we set up for King Crocoduck's video, is understanding that language's meaning has long been debated in science. It's not a new phenomenon. And in fact, you can kind of trace back this, what is the content of language, all the way back to the Vienna Circle. So let's see. Let's just read it out. Okay, so logical positivism differs from the philosophies of Comte and John Stuart Mill in holding that metaphysical doctrines are not false but meaningless, and that great unanswerable questions about substance, causality, freedom, and God are unanswerable just because they are not genuine questions at all. This last is a thesis about language, not about nature. So see, these debates have been going back for a while about who gets to construct what, the use of language and the values it imports and what it can say, mapping onto the world with a sort of verification approach to matching our experience to our language to our ideas. Anyway, all genuine philosophy, according to the group, is a critique of language. And according to some of its leading members, its result is to show the unity of science, that all genuine knowledge about nature can be expressed in a single language common to all the sciences. So the Vienna Circle, which first produced its manifesto in 1929, had its origins in discussions among physicists and mathematicians before World War I. The general conclusion was that the empiricism of Mill and Mach was inadequate because it fails to explain mathematical and logical truths, and because it did not account satisfactorily for the apparent a priori element in natural science. One of the leaders laid before students the Tractatus by Wittgenstein, and this work introduced a new general theory of meaning derived in part from the logical inquiries of a various number of people, including Russell and Whitehead, and gave it its foundation. The thing is that there was a lot of then criticism. So interest in logical positivism began to wane in the 1950s, and by 1970s it ceased to exist as a distinct philosophical movement because when you say only scientific statements have meaning, is that a statement of meaning? There's a little bit of when you try to apply the rules to your own logic that it starts to fall apart. So I would say that most people today are still influenced by logical positivism. I mean, I can't speak for the natural sciences, but in terms of my experience with the social sciences and the quantitative fields, there is still an influence as to, let's say, a divide, the quant-qual divide, shall we say. That still exists. But I don't think that you'll find many sort of naive logical positivists anymore. I think most people would consider themselves maybe like a neo-positivist. Let me look that up. Neo-positivism. Right, here we go. So neo-positivism, a movement in the early 20th century American sociology, which blended together the three themes of quantification, behaviorism, and a positivist epistemology. Its proponents were Giddings, Lundberg, and basically arguing, as far as neo-positivism having lasting influence, let's see. Let's just read it out. Giddings offered a defense of behaviorism, arguing that psychology has become experimental and objective. It discriminated between reflex and conditioning. He also insisted that sociology is a science statistical in method, or sociology is science statistical in method, and that a true and complete description of anything must include a measurement of it. Similarly, Lundberg contained that sociology could be modeled on the natural sciences and should observe the behavior of human beings in social situations, but without reference to concepts such as feelings, ends, motives, values, and will. And like Giddings, he argued that science dealt in exact descriptions and generalizations, both of which required the quantitative statement. He emphasized the importance of attitude scales in this context and insisted that science cannot formulate value statements and that sociology must be a science in this mold. So yes, its influence is still there. Although, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, so it's hard for me to kind of locate. I mean, I do political science, which is a form of sociology in that it's the study of groups, but we tend to, you know, like I read some in sociology, but in very specific sections. So is it still having an influence? I would say yes. So, all right, that was a big that was a big distraction from what the video is actually supposed to be about, which is we're going to look at the rest of King Crocoduck's video, or at least we're going to try to. I already found so many things to tear apart, like, so I started rewatching it today, and I had my notes, but I've taken so many notes. Like, I started it an hour before, and it started around minute 12:45, and I got to minute 16:30. And I have all these notes already about things. I got a lot of problems with you people. So anyway, yeah, I might as well, if King Crocoduck is going to complain about, oh, but you didn't look at the second part of my video, I'm like, okay, I'll tear that apart too. I mean, I have watched it. It's not good. So I don't know why he's so keen to, where's my channel history? Sorry. History, that's what I want. Okay. We'll pause this up. Okay, so I guess just generally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems, the unequal structuring of this piece. So let's treat this like as if it were an essay. So the first part of the essay is setting up the proper way to have done this, right? Is if you're going to make an argument, you actually have to make an argument. Now, before we start this, I'm just going to look in the comments a little bit just to check out how everybody is doing before we start, and then I will start going on the video. So let's first increase the size. Boom, boom, boom. Easier for me to read. Okay. Let me just see what you guys are saying before we get started, because this should be kind of an interactive section. All right. Yes, I am live. Oh, Ali, yeah, that was me destroying Sargon. Yeah, that was a while ago. To keep my dog company most of New Year's Eve. Oh, yes. Good morning, good morning, morning. Logical positivists, we already talked about. You should sign up for my course first. Yes, I think the fundamental flaw, and I'll just say this, to start off, is that King Crocoduck looks at the world from a very situational point of view, which is ironic, because he's saying that that is impossible in science. But he is very much like a white dude located in the natural sciences, and rather than going out and actually understanding how science operates, he is working within his little bailiwick of comfort and making a lot of accusations against other people that he can't substantiate. And so yeah, the problem is that he has not really thought about science out. It doesn't seem to me. He's never demonstrated, shall we say, at least not in this video for sure, and the other ones leading up to this, that he understands how science is practiced in the social sciences. Nor does he even really engage with the existence of the social sciences, or why a social constructionist view would be very important when you're studying the social world. None of that. It's like, if it's not about the heliocentric versus the geocentric model of the universe, the solar system, then it's not science, which is just completely ridiculous. So, moving on, let's see. From memory, my course was logical positivism grounded in rejecting social science. No, there are positivists in the social science as well. So I wouldn't say that. It is a more philosophical perspective and not necessarily a way of doing science. It's a perspective on what exists, what we can say about it, what we can know about it, what is meaningful. And it is trying to say that science creates meaningful statements while also undermining the idea that language is about values is, like I said, a little bit self-contradictory. Any more fixes? Okay. Playing, okay, people are playing games. Social construct, yes. Logic is stupid. All right, I think we are caught up. We can compare the first part and the second part of this video because it's very clear how King Crocoduck strawmans social constructionism as a practice in the second part of the video. The first part of the video, entitled "Is Science a Social Construct?", spends a lot of time defining scientific terms and imbuing its process with a lot of legitimation. There's a lot of value being added in terms of these things are valuable and this is good and this is what should be done. Now, I'm not saying that science isn't useful or science doesn't work, but it's just a little bit ironic that he is taking this approach of science being above all these sorts of things and sort of like this objective reality, and yet he's imbuing his first part of the video with a lot of definitions and value, putting quite a high degree of value on the scientific process, but then he doesn't mirror that level of definition and citation and example in the second part of the video. So you can already see that he is not treating both sides of the equation, and that's not really the word I'm looking for. He's not treating both sides of the argument equally. He doesn't properly define social constructionism. He doesn't quote any examples from studies. He doesn't illustrate an example of social constructionism. So he spends this first part of his video blinding you with science. And then the second part of it is really just based off of, as we'll see, straw man arguments and ad hominems, trying to insult people and misrepresent them rather than actually explaining what a social construct is. He also does this thing of like, oh, well, if you say that things exist in a society and that's how knowledge is produced, well, that's a truism. Well, no, that's... You've just accepted that science is a social construct, but without saying it, because he didn't want to say it. So again, there's a lot of bait and switching and blinding people with science, and also, that's not what I wanted, and appeals to authority as well. So where are we going to start? Okay, I guess we're going to start back at 1255. Yes, here. And how do you explain science to someone who has a rust better, who never went to school and never really came across anything much scientific? All right, I think the way that I would explain science to somebody who never went to school and never really came across anything much scientific is to kind of do it honestly from a philosophical perspective. I think one of the greatest contributions philosophically to science in the modern era, after its development over the course of several centuries, was the idea of falsification. Now, there's a lot of ways you can look at how theories are examined, and Gary Edwards, who I've never seen publish anything, by the way, we'll talk about, verification and other things. But the one thing that makes science quite unique in its approach, because you can use like a correspondence theory or whatever else, is that science makes predictions about the world that can be shown to be wrong. And I think that that's where I would start with science, is that science is a process of explaining the world. And when it makes, what makes it scientific, especially what really sets it apart from pseudoscience, which can look at the world and get things right by chance, as has been pointed out by the inventor of the falsification theory. Why am I forgetting his name? I can see it. Science is falsification, and it's on the Stephen Jay Gould Popper. Karl Popper with a K. Karl with the, I mean, Karl, not the Popper. Now he took a slightly more like rigid proposal initially, or he proposed a very rigid system, which has been modified currently by most people who do science now, because it's a little too over the top. But the idea is you make a prediction that can be shown to be wrong, and if you're wrong, then your explanation's not very good. And at the end of the day, that's, for me at least, what really sets science apart, is that it's willing to try to explain the world in a way that can be tested and shown to be wrong, so we know what to reject and what to accept. And you can do that with the social world as well as the natural world. And yet, King Crocoduck never draws on the social sciences at all. In fact, the only references he keeps making is to like science and technology, which I assume is his little world of the natural sciences. But there's a lot of science besides his little bubble. I hope that answers your explanation. Or answers. God, I need more coffee this morning. I hope that answers your question. All right, now I see that I've got the top chat on. I'm going to change that to the full chat. There we go. Not that it makes a huge, but let's have a little look-see at what we've got here. Oh, you know what? I've got the sound coming out the wrong area again. I keep switching what speakers I'm using, and then you guys can hear it and I can't. So let me also go back a few seconds. Let's just go from here. And I'll also put on the closed captioning as well. Oh, you know what you also need is your sound. That's what happens when you set up late. All right, I think we're set to go now.
Shifts, like background propositions, can be understood as a mechanism by...
Get this any bigger? I don't want... Yeah, that'll do. All right.
which scientific knowledge is unified under a more comprehensive...
Ooh, that's kind of quiet for you guys, isn't it? Well, I'll turn it up here, and I'll also turn it up in the thing. I didn't do my test this morning. As I said, I was running late because I was trying to prep for this by listening, and it was so bad. Okay, we'll go back a little bit so we can get the full context of his statements.
Of both, despite the fact that neither will be equipped to describe the entities dealt with by this more general, more fundamental theory. Thus, paradigm shifts, like background propositions, can be understood as a mechanism by which scientific knowledge is unified under a more comprehensive framework.
Now, another thing that we'll talk about, or one thing you can notice about his first section in science, is that he doesn't talk about the role of people in this at all. He just talks about it like it's this thing that happens, you know, and that people aren't involved with it, which is often a way those who don't really want to deal with the fact that it's human produced will do. And there's an objectivity there that's somehow special, that I don't know, has some kind of special magic power to it that makes it better than other things that people do. But this sort of speaking, and it's actually an approach that let me just talk a little bit about how these things can influence the way science is presented. Oftentimes when we write in scientific articles, and this is across disciplines, there is a norm or a practice of not talking about I or what I think or whatever else. We talk about knowledge as if it's like from this bird's eye, godlike view. And that is a way to see more objective about it and hands-off and less biased. And although it is a common practice, it's not really often reflected on what kind of value that brings to knowledge. So, yeah. Oh my God, we're a half hour in already? Christy, shut up. Okay.
Our final definition is of science, which is that set of processes that test and develop models whose various properties have just been laid out.
No. I mean, that is one part of how you do science, but that is not a definition for science. Science is a process of knowledge production, and one of those ways is to test models, but that's an inferential process. There's also just description. Sometimes the process of science is just to describe what is there first, because then you can, from our observations, you can go inductively into theory and then try to derive general principles and then deductively test them. So this is an incorrect definition of science. It is a description of how certain types of science are practiced. Practiced? Yeah. But it is not the description of science. Science is a process of knowledge production. It's an epistemological process. First of all, what exists and how can we know it? And then we get into, okay, so if we think this exists and we think we can observe it, then what approaches or methodologies do we have at our disposal to actually go out into the world and measure this? And then what are we measuring? And what are our instruments? And do our instruments have bias? And blah, 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 blah. So no, this is not a definition of science. It's an inadequate, biased, and there's I don't see any source for this either. Just a picture of, ooh, sciencey things. Look at all the dots, and ooh, my model, be impressed at the size of my R-square, adjusted R-square.
Because the scientific activity tests models rather than individual facts.
I honestly don't even know what this means. Scientific activity tests models rather than individual facts. First, not all scientific activity is about model testing. As I said, some of it is about description. It's just describing something that hasn't been observed before. So that's science. And then the other thing, like the idea that tests models rather than individual facts. If you have what you think is a fact and your model is testing the assumption that produced that fact, and then you get a different result that contradicts that fact, then actually you are testing that fact. And none of that nonsense, which is like gobbledygook, is a refutation of the premise that scientific facts are social constructs. It's just not. You haven't demonstrated they're not socially constructed between human beings engaged in a process of knowledge production. Because that's what science is. All kinds of mads, because I didn't talk about this, the crappiest part of his video. Okay, let's go.
The statement that motivated this entire controversy is somewhat malformed.
No, what's malformed is your understanding of what a social construct is and how it is related to the concept that scientific facts are produced through a consensus-building agreement on what are the standards for knowledge, how that knowledge should be produced, and which forms of that knowledge should be accepted. All of that is socially constructed. It's just so easy to refute. All kinds of just no. Just no. I just feel like that's what I want to keep stamping on this. Just no on this video.
But that is a minor quibble.
The whole point of your video is that science is not a social construct, but you haven't demonstrated that yet. All right, so now let me just premise this by saying, unlike the first part of the video, he's not going to provide any systematic examples series of definitions. He's just going to start now making bold claims as to what all social constructionists think and what social constructionism is, without actually quoting social constructionists, not just one. Anyone can have one opinion. You're talking about the whole discipline thinks these things and the whole discipline teaches these things, yet he cannot substantiate that in his videos. The other thing that he does is he does these sorts of things too, where he will bring up a very provocative, in his view, I guess, video. I'm sorry, I'm really having a hard time this morning with my lack of coffee. I'm only 1 cup of coffee in and I need about 3 more. He'll make comments about what social constructionism is or believes or thinks, and then he'll use these out of context images that are meant to be mocked and not understood. He doesn't engage with the content he's putting on the screen, really. He just puts it up there to be owned. And this is such poor, it's just logical fallacy. It's a form of poisoning the well, it's a form of ad hominems, and it's a straw man argument. So, here we go. Colonization, racism, immigration, native rights, sexism, ableism, queer, trans, intersex, phobia, and economic justice are scientific issues. Now, the other thing, that he could have done in this video is actually acknowledge that science has problems with values tainting its approach and its scientific research agenda, its methods of data collection and analysis, and the kinds of results that get published. Do we have to look up scientific racism? Scientific racism is it's still a problem in the sciences. We can also look at Tuskegee and the unethical violations of American black men's human rights, because white men in the sciences didn't value the lives of black men. We can look at the fact that throughout history and even today, there are studies that are published in medical journals that only use cis male bodies in their tests, and yet the results are supposed to be applied to everybody. Well, do you really think that if women were running these, if they had were participating and engaging in this, that they go, yeah, let's just ignore half the population because it's easier that way? That's a value. That is a value being smuggled into your medical science. You're basically saying, I don't want to have to ask for more money for my study. I don't want to have to control for cis women's hormone cycles, or people who are on, who are transitioning and using hormones. That's too complicated. So I'm just going to ignore all those people. That's a value. That's a value that they're putting into their science. And the lack of any acknowledgement of this makes me think that King Crocoduck hasn't really thought too deeply about these issues. Instead, he gets offended and bristles at the idea that his science isn't somehow perfect, and then he lashes out. So, hey, Pasta, welcome for the stream. Actually, I'm going to need to take a break in a couple minutes here, so sorry about that, everybody. All right, let's take a little bit more before we take a break, and I get more coffee. All right, so just be prepared for this thing where he makes generalized accusations about what social constructionists do, think, or say, and he puts up a quote that actually doesn't substantiate his point at all on the screen. So let's just watch.
Now that we're armed with a better understanding of what science is, and
by the way, you have no better understanding of what science is based on this video. As I've shown, he doesn't know science outside of like a sub-discipline specific method approach, like not epistemologically, not methodologically, like measurement and all those kinds of issues, not even ontologically.
And how it operates, we may examine what is meant by propositions to the effect of science is a social construct and what they imply.
Right, so you'd think, okay, now we're going to get some definitions of social construct and social constructionism, and we're going to look at some development of the ideas over time. We're going to look at some study examples. We're going to get the equal time that he gave to science and all of the non-social construct related things that he presented. He spent 10 minutes or so on this that has nothing to do with the question of being a social construct.
If one were merely to say that scientific models are social constructs because they wouldn't exist absent a society, one would be stating a truism.
So this is how he sidesteps the entire issue. I've watched this once through, and I've seen this other part of it. I don't remember him ever giving a fair definition of social constructionism. And what he's basically saying is he's conceding the point that within a society, individuals organize or information, and they are the ones who decide processes and values and what is to be considered valid and not. And so this is his way of just basically saying, actually, yes, science is a social construct.
A model, by definition, is a description of reality.
A model by definition. I guess you're right. That I will say, I think he's
and descriptions require social actors.
Yes. Yeah, a thing produced by human beings requires human beings. But that is not all that social constructionism is talking about. It's talking about a process of value production. All right, guys, I am dying. I'm going to need a comfort break here. So, I'm really sorry. I should have gotten farther in this. And I know it's taking forever, for which I apologize. But I had some really good questions earlier on, and I think it's an interesting one about logical yes, coffee break. All right, give me 5 minutes, get fresh coffee, stretch my legs, do my other stuff. I'm really sorry to be dodging this early on in the session, but I'm so, I need a break. All right, let me go ahead, turn up the music. I'm going to mute my mic. And we'll see. Oh, see you guys in a little bit, like 5 minutes. Hi. Was that 5 minutes? I don't even know. I just took whatever time I needed. Sorry. You guys doing all right? All right. So now that I can concentrate more, let's get back to it. We'll continue on with this. Basically, of his, he's just sidestepped the admission. Actually, yes, science is totally a social construct. Like 100% totally. So let's not talk about that. Instead, he's going to just try to attack... well, there's a couple ad hominems and straw men that end up coming out here, which we'll see. And here's the thing is, if you actually could make... So I'm going to move my mic again. If you could make a good argument, you wouldn't have to straw man people. So I'm just saying. You know, you'll notice that when Kevin and I do our happy hours and we mock people, we'll go look up what they said. We'll go find the article. We do our background work and we show it and we read through it, and maybe we got something a little bit wrong, or there's a context that we missed, but we make the effort to be transparent like that because we don't want people to take it on faith, and you do. You're actually, what's interesting about this is that King Crocoduck is, for all his love of science, he's not demonstrating he's right. He's demanding to be believed. Which is kind of one of the critiques of how science can be practiced. Ironic, isn't it? All right. Again, he doesn't define what social constructs are or what social constructionism is in the same way that he defined all those things on the scientific side, even though all those things on the scientific side really had nothing much to do with the question at hand. And again, he'll put on these things like race and science are both social constructs. Yes. And developed through colonization. Now, I'm going to be honest, I think that colonization critiques generally come more from a sociological perspective. And so the ones, as a political scientist, the ones I'm more familiar with are racism, sexism, ableism, because I don't necessarily look at the international context. My research is on Western countries. And, oh, can't hear the video. Thank you. Yes, you're right. It's completely muted. I appreciate that check. Okay, we can go back a few seconds. You can hear his voice. So thank you very much for that catch. I did that to make sure I didn't distract you guys during the break. So thank you for catching that error. But that said, I'll let you hear that now. And you can see what I meant when I said that. Okay. So I'll let his audio go.
Would be stating a truism. A model, by definition, is a description of reality, and descriptions require social actors. This is utterly uncontroversial, but does not exhaust the meaning of such statements as scientific facts are social constructs, even though some social constructionists will make it seem as though this were all that were being implied.
The problem here is that he doesn't understand the different levels on which science can be practiced, right? Social constructionism is a perspective that goes all the way from the ontological down to the specific methods you use. What do I mean when I say that? Social constructionism, I mean, the various stages, we went through this in the last video. The first question you have to ask if you want to know about the world is what exists? What exists? And then that is a question of ontology, right? And I think the comparison I made last time was it's kind of one thing to go, oh, a tree exists because we have a material physical thing we can see and interact with. We can look at patterns in terms of what different types of trees have in common. We can interact with it physically, whatever else. We can agree some meanings of what constitutes a leaf and what constitutes a branch. And all of those things can be visually inspected and verified, right? But what about racism? Does racism exist? Democracy. Does democracy exist? These things have a material impact on our lives. Right? Now, not personally me. I've never been a victim of racism. But there are people who have to live their lives in a specific kind of way because of racism. They have to think about their interactions with police in a way I don't as a white person. They have to think about driving their car and what they wear and all kinds of things. They have to regulate their human behaviors because of racism. So you can't point at racism like you can point at a tree, but clearly racism exists. So then how does it exist? Well, it exists in attitudes, and it also exists in the social structures and norms, right? And democracy doesn't exist. I measured it. Right. So in that way, race, those perspectives on social constructionism, I'm more familiar with issues of those than colonization. So I can't, as I am sure that there are a good basis for making, for the colonization issue, especially I would say probably it's more important in international politics and development studies. Also international relations. These are all areas of human activity and political science and sociology that are going to be influenced by colonization. So, again, I'm not entirely familiar with this. However, I am not immediately suspicious of it just because King Crocoduck doesn't properly understand it, which is kind of the theme of this whole video.
To say that science is a social construct is to say that the conclusions reached by a scientific model are not just shaped by facts, but are also shaped by values that are particular to the social situation of whoever is doing the research.
Now, yes and no. Yeah. So yes to the first part, no to the second part. And this is another problem is, he will put up something like this and then put up neurosexism and try to, by association, discredit something like neurosexism, when neurosexism is merely stating something that you can obviously see in the scientific practices. So let's go back a little bit. Right. Facts, let's see, are not, okay, scientific model are not just shaped by facts. So this is kind of a malformed comment. All right, let's say.
Say that the conclusions reached by a scientific model are not just shaped by facts.
Okay, first of all, the conclusions reached by a scientific model aren't shaped by facts. I don't know what facts you're thinking the model is being shaped by. The model produces things that can be made into facts. So again, I don't understand what he thinks happens during model testing, or why he thinks models are shaped by facts. This to me is a malformed sentence. Scientific models test propositions, and the results of those tests may become facts. Now, the reason I say may become facts is because not everything you put into your model is going to end up being interpreted. Only your statistically, at least in doing social sciences, your statistically significant variables will end up being interpreted and drawn up in your conclusion. So, again, I don't know what he means by a scientific model being not just shaped by facts. But he's going to say here, yeah, go on.
But are also shaped by values that are particular to the social situation of whoever is doing the research.
So first of all, there's no quote for this. I don't know who he's trying to say thinks this, but science is value-laden. For instance, we prefer simpler models to more complicated ones. That's a value. We have certain standards for what variables are considered to have causal relationships and impacts, and others aren't, that are arbitrary. And there's also instances when, yes, who does the science? It doesn't affect like the statistical significance test, but it might affect what gets studied, what gets attention, and how things are interpreted. Again, we can look at sexism in the medical field. We can look at Tuskegee. In fact, we should look at Tuskegee. Talk a little bit about this neutral objective science that King Crocoduck here, I looked this up earlier, as being somehow devoid of any values, of not being at all charged with a problem of sexism, that there's no racism in science, that there's no human flaws at all. I think part of, he could have done a better job of making this video if he would have at least conceded some of the critiques, because otherwise he's opening himself up to really obvious stuff like this. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, right? This was science. It ran through the 1970s. It ran until the year I was born. That's not that long ago, King Crocoduck. Right, so the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was an unethical natural history study conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control. The purpose of the study was to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis, and the African-American men who participated in the study were told that they were getting free health care from the federal government. You look at Tuskegee and you tell me that science isn't open for these kinds of critiques, that it is not somehow practiced with racism, that it is not practiced with sexism. It has been. Those are facts. That's not theory, that is fact. And do you know what it was that pointed these things out and raised objections and made people question the values with which they did science? It was things like feminist critique. It was things like a racial critique of science and pointing out the sexism and racism. And yeah, I could also see like this is colonialism, right? This was a crime performed under the auspices of science that is supposed to make it neutral and somehow not bad. And we haven't even talked about all of the scientific studies done motivated by racism under the Nazis. Does he ever address this in his video? Does he ever take up the fact to even concede that science is a human process, is able to be influenced by the worst parts of our own perspectives, and that our own biases can be put into our scientific models and therefore assumed? Like the way that Charles Darwin assumed a sexual binary doesn't mean that you can cite Darwin as an authority as of having proven there's only, two sexes. He started with that assumption, and he fit all of his observations into that already predetermined category instead of working inductively from observation. He had a normative view of what sex should be, and he imposed that on the world and then divided it up neatly so that it mirrored his own belief systems. This is what we're talking about. So, yes, there is so much here that he sidesteps and tries to sound really arrogant about, as if his approach is the best one, not at all acknowledging any of this history and any of the obvious evidence for this, or all the experiments the Japanese did in World War II. Yes, human beings have the ability to bring in their biases into their science, and then by doing so, they make it seem like it has authority. Biological essentialism is a perfect example of this. A lot of people, but if you go online, and I can show videos where people say, oh, well, we're biologically determined to, men are biologically determined to do X and women are biologically determined to do Y. That's a value statement, and it's not even borne out by observation. But people want to hide behind science. They want to, it's just, it's common sense, when actually it's like sexism or racism. All right, continuing on.
Arguments for why this is the case will vary from coffee shop to coffee shop.
So here, again, this is a straw man. It's not really straw man, sorry. Let me rephrase that. It's an ad hom. He's basically saying that people who do social constructionism aren't academics. They're not professional. They're not peer-reviewed. They just sit in their coffee shops. And I think he stole this idea from Gary Edwards, who likes to talk about coffee shop philosophers or coffee shop sociologists or whatever. Again, never actually naming people or putting up their own publications. And so this, again, is another logical fallacy that you can use to point out the weakness in his actual evidence and arguments in this video. All right, so Max says, I feel physicists can have a really blinkered view of it because it's really hard to draw a link between the properties of electrons and sexism. Right, and they don't tend to look at the higher level sciences. I would absolutely agree with that. I think there is a real straw man that King Crocoduck is setting up here, which is that somehow social constructionists want to create different kinds of sciences for different kinds of demographic groups, and that is not the point. Like he doesn't actually find anyone who says that. This again is like another straw man he puts up. But yeah, when you're looking at things, the properties of electrons, let's say, you're thinking about the scientific process as a tool, and using it as a way of eliminating bad explanations and finding the most parsimonious and what we hope are the most accurate explanations. But that's not the only way that science gets practiced. There are a lot of assumptions that go into that beforehand. And even so much as creating a lab environment that is very much a boys' club. Let's say that you had a lab environment where there were pictures of half-naked women up, and you have jokes about very sexualization, and you create a very hostile work environment for anyone who isn't like a cis heterosexual dude, right? Now, one could say, oh, well, that has nothing to do with the scientific process, but it does, because it is the environment in which science is being produced. And so those kinds of things, it is not just about the experimental part of science. It's also about the environment in which science is taking place. And is that place open up for critique? And it's funny that for someone who is so interested in the principle of, let's say, falsification, and showing something and being capable of shown to be wrong, King Crocoduck is quite precious about the principle of science as a general idea. Like, he's not stepping back to critique the process of science. Instead, he is attacking those who are trying to critique the process.
But the feature common to all varieties of social constructionism is the belief that scientific conclusions are necessarily influenced by socially specific background values.
I honestly have no idea what he means by this. And the problem is he doesn't quote anybody saying this. He doesn't give a definition for background values. If he means demographics, maybe that's what he means, but maybe there are other things that are background values, but he doesn't give a definition. Nor does he quote anyone saying this. He doesn't put up a quote here in this screen that we're looking at right now. This side, no, this side, that side. I have to go the other side, that side. He just makes these assertions. And this is quite common for the rest of his video. He doesn't quote social constructionists. He just makes accusations as to what they believe. And as someone who works with a social construction, like, I consider myself both foundationalist and anti-foundationalist. So when it comes, so I do a mixed methods approach to social research, political social research in this case. I think that these are not incompatible ideas, that there are material effects that influence people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And that there are, thank you, Rory Katz, and that there are people, that there are influences that are socially constructed that also affect people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, or their value system, however you want to define those things, whichever ones you like. And so aging, obviously, aging is a material change. And that's who you say a foundationalist. It exists in the world. It's a foundational principle that it has an effect. I think wealth has a material impact on how you experience the world. What body you're born into, right? Kind of like your ethnic background, or your ability or disability, your sex and gender. All of these things will have determinative influences on how you grow up because of the society's views of those roles. You can't help but be shaped by those things. But now some of those, like the attitude parts of it, are not like aging. I can't witness racism. I can't witness sexism, but they exist in terms of the society, and that is the anti-foundationalist, or the constructionist, I guess, is the way that reality is socially constructed. So the thing he says here is that all varieties of social constructionism believe
scientific conclusions are necessarily influenced by socially specific background values.
Now that's interesting because, I've read Searle, and I've read, so two books that I recommend. One I'm going through now, and I tried to do a review of it, but it's so dense and hard to get through. I got really tired because I had to read it 3 times to do it. And I should finish it. Maybe this will be my motivation. The Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Luckman is probably the most influential book on me in terms of my understanding. And Berger and Luckman are very precise. I mean, they're Germans, so they have this very very step-by-step methodological perspective on doing this. And if you look at it, they talk about, what do you need to have a socially constructed reality? Well, you need a person, you need people who have, like physical bodies and the ability to interact with the world. You need a world that they live in. And you need other people, because we get all of our knowledge from other people, basically. And then you need language, and you need some way of communications. And it can be not just spoken language, but it can be signs and symbols and other things like that. So they're very step by step in building up this idea. None of it has the requirement that he's saying here. Another good book that I've read is Searle's, and that is The Reality of Social Construction. I think, if I can spell, reality of social. Yeah, I think. The Construction of Social Reality, yes, by John Searle, who is, I think, primarily known as a philosopher of language. But this, too, talks about the way that we link up our linguistic acknowledgments, our socially constructed reality with our material reality. I remember this. So, for instance, you can say you're married, but if you don't have a marriage license, people don't really consider you married. You haven't done the thing. The piece of paper itself only represents something that's meaningful to people, but we need that physical reality. Money, I don't have all of the money in my bank account. I have a series of digits on a computer. But to me, that's money. So it's about linking the material world with the things that we talk about existing. So anyway, that also does not require anything about science. The last one I want to point to, now I have the second edition of this. Social, I might have her first name wrong. Yeah. No, I don't. Vivian Burr, that was it. Yeah, I've got the second edition of Social Constructionism. Introduces students to the area of social science theory and research. That also doesn't say, here is a requirement of social constructionism. So again, King Crocoduck is making an assertion about the empirical world, about what people do, think, or say, and he's not citing anything. He's just asserting it. So, the whole point of science is getting information not from other people, but from the world around us. Well, if you're doing social science, it sure is about getting attitudes from people, like voter intention. What's your most important election thing? What do you think about the economy? Macroeconomics? Both prospective and retrospective economic evaluations. People's whether or not they're going to wear masks is going to have an impact on whether or not COVID spreads. So, of course, science is about, you can use, science can be applied to people. And the other thing about that, Rusty, is that most of the information that you accept from science, you haven't experienced directly. You're just taking it on faith. You haven't gone into space to see whether or not the sun travels around the Earth travels around the sun or the other way around. You just accept it. So you do get information from other people. Most people, unless you are doing the work yourselves, all information, all knowledge is mediated through other people. And you can check that and triangulate that with other people, but you're triangulating it with other people. So yeah, I just have to challenge a premise. But this is not getting information from people, but about people. Well, okay, so how do you know that Pluto is not a planet, it's a dwarf planet? How is that fact established? Did you go to Pluto, Rusty? Or did you believe other people? How do you know how many, electrons or protons or whatever else says? Like, what is the atomic weight of whatever, fill in the blank? You're getting that from people. Now, they're producing it through a scientific process, but you're not replicating that process for every piece of information. Have you done tests to make sure gravity is really what people think it is? Your knowledge buildup is mostly taken as just accepting through trust what most people say. So you are getting information from people. Now, you're trusting that the process that they're using is a correct process, but that trust is built on a social construct based on values of what constitutes valid knowledge and can be seen as a fact. That makes sense? Okay, so I don't know what he means by background values have to be introduced, and he doesn't quote anybody saying it, nor does he show an example. So again, more logical fallacies and straw people.
Scientific facts are not just theory-laden, but are also value-laden.
Again, science is the result of values. Science is a value. The whole point of science is that the idea that is premised on the valuing of certain kinds of information that is replicable and and independently verifiable. Those are all values. Science is a value-laden process. And then we can talk about the ways that other values, like sexism, come into it and distort the way that medical science has been done over time, or racism, and the same thing. So,
according to the social constructionists, whether it's because of differences in epistemic privilege by virtue of different social situations, differences in the psychologies of different groups due to differences in upbringing, or the unique historical and cultural contexts that shape every discourse, including science, every scientist will construct scientific knowledge in a manner that reflects their place in society.
Honestly, he's never provided a quote for this. And as someone who looks at and is a practicing social constructionist, that's not how I see the world. It's not a determinative thing, like everyone must do this or everyone. It's asking people, it's a critique, it's a criticism of unreflective biases that were being smuggled into the science being done by cis, hetero, white guys who had patriarchal attitudes and racist assumptions. And that's a real thing. Scientific racism is a real thing. The fallacy of biological essentialism is a real thing. I think he would have done better in this video to actually acknowledge that some of the critiques of science and the way that values are smuggled into it are valid. But here, what's also really strange to me is that he adds, I don't know where he got this. Deconstructionism? Deconstructionism has to do, I understand it kind of follows on a little bit, but deconstructionism deals with text and meaning. It's in literary analysis. He doesn't explain this. So deconstructionism is a theory of literary criticism that questions traditional assumptions about certainty, identity, and truth, and asserts that words can only refer to other words and attempts to demonstrate how statements about any text subvert their own meaning. But instead of actually trying to explain what standpoint theory is, and again, I don't see a lot of, he's not presented any evidence that linking standpoint theory and scientific practices or psychoanalysis, he's not showing any person saying these things or explaining any of these concepts. He's just putting them up here. See how they're rotten? Oh, they're rotten, they're rotten, they're rotten. This is not, this is a logical fallacy. I guess it's a sort of unconscious poisoning the well, and also it's a straw man argument. So again, poor.
A privilege.
Now I'm mixing up doing science and learning about science. No, we're talking about science as a process, Rustworth. Right? Science is a process of knowledge production. And if you put in bad assumptions in the process, you're going to get those same results out. If you go looking, scientific racism, go check it out. People are smuggling racism into science. That's a real thing. And it should be critiqued, and it should be pointed out, and it should be rooted out and reflected on. So I don't see the difference. Learning about science and doing science starts off from a philosophical perspective. I think you should, I don't know if you've read a lot of the philosophy of science, but science is a knowledge production process. Therefore, it has to do with what humans value and how humans know things and how we use language. So I don't even length is a physical property. Yes, it's also a completely subjective physical property. I don't know. You're kind of is Rustworthy just King Crocoduck in hiding? Is that what it is? You can just come out wherever you are. I don't see what your objection is valid here. All right, heading back. All right, so what King Crocoduck wants to do is basically straw people or misrepresent the social constructionist point of view by asserting that everybody thinks things that he can't show anybody thinking.
Privileged member of society will incorporate one set of background values into their models in
where does this, who said this, and where do they point it out happening? Again, to me, these are all straw man arguments. I don't see any I don't see social constructionists saying, oh, at what point too? He tries to talk about these background values as if but he wants to put the background values in the I don't know. If there's a whole lot of mushiness and lack of clarity, it would help a lot if you could cite actual people doing these things. But what you get instead in the second section especially, I think comes down to Russell's never trust a stupid man's report of what a clever man said, because he must translate what he hears into something he can understand. And because King Crocoduck hasn't actually done the work to understand the philosophy of science or the philosophy of language, and how meaning is constructed, he is misinterpreting things and then presenting them as if they were sort of like self-evidently obviously ridiculous. But what's self-evidently obvious is that he doesn't understand them.
In order to maintain the status quo, an oppressed member of society will incorporate another set of background values.
You don't produce knowledge just by learning about it. Well, nobody said you did. But you learn about it not by the production. You learn about it by believing the people that you give authority to as accepting their word that it was produced. And that's what makes all of it socially constructed. I think you don't produce knowledge just by learning about it, but that wasn't the issue. The question is that when we learn about science, we take it on faith based on authority, right? We don't have direct experience of everything that we know. I don't go out and test leaves to see what the level of carbon dioxide to oxygen conversion is. I just accept it because it was put into a textbook. So there's a level of trust here when it comes to the production of knowledge, and that makes it important that we understand and critique that knowledge production process, because it is done by humans and therefore flawed. So I don't know what you're arguing anymore, Rusty.
Values into their models in order to bring about emancipatory change.
Now, he doesn't define emancipatory change. He doesn't define standpoint theory. He doesn't define any of these things. I think mostly because he doesn't understand them. But he still has contempt for them, which just shows that, again, a lack of learning, in my opinion.
Neither model has any objective advantage over the other because both are ultimately the subjective expressions of whoever develops them.
But the thing is that science does have values about parsimony. So just because you take things from a social construction point of view, it doesn't mean that you're going to prefer models that don't perform as well. I mean, I don't understand what he's trying to say here. And again, because he's not actually quoting anyone directly, I can only assume that he is misrepresenting what he's heard maybe second or third hand other people say. But I am unconvinced that he actually is giving a charitable or even a steelman argument to social constructionism. And by the way, none of this refutes the idea that science is a social construct. All the sort of like when he does his sort of blind you with science in the first part of the video, and now he's going to do blind you with logical fallacies. None of this actually is an argument against the idea that science as a process of knowledge production is not a socially constructed activity with socially constructed outcomes. None of it. So the subjective stuff only comes into play when you learn about science, not when you do the hard science stuff itself. Well, then tell me about Tuskegee, Rust. Tell me about the subjective stuff when they decided to let African-American men lie to them that they were getting free health care when really they were just letting the syphilis run through their bodies. Is that subjective when it comes to who gets picked for these studies and why? And what they were willing to lie about and how they were willing to devalue their lives? That there's nothing subjective. It's completely objective, that kind of scientifically reinforced racism. Or how about the fact that that medical studies routinely exclude cis women and I'm sure people who are trans and using hormones from their studies, despite the fact that the treatments will be used on those people. There's no bias or subjective stuff going on in that selection of who gets to be part of the study and who doesn't. I mean, that's just not the way the world works. Bias comes in, and it's only through feminist critique and it's through racial critique that racism, that sexism is pointed out. So you just don't have evidence. I'm sorry. Like, if you look at the world, if you look at the empirical evidence, the idea that subjective stuff only comes into play when you learn about science is simply just easy to refute. Absolutely. And I guess when you say hard science, of course, you're looking very narrowly at physics, and you're ignoring the fact that science is not just the purview of physicists and astrophysicists. It's used to produce medical knowledge. It's used to produce information about human geography. It's used to study the economy. Econometrics is a science, right? So I think the problem here is that you're falsely narrowing down what science is to the Enlightenment perspective of the natural sciences before Durkheim. And you're not engaging with the sociological aspects of that knowledge production. I think that's the problem. How is that connected with the measurement and data collection? So if your sample is only cis men, that will affect your measurements and data collection when you want to generalize from your sample to the wider population. If you only use men, then the only generalized population you should apply that medical treatment to is men. But of course, that's not what people do. They give it to women too, and trans people, right? So that's an example. Same thing with this, the ethics of the Tuskegee thing here. When you're using people's bodies as experiment, as basically lab rats, and the ethics of that. So, yeah, measurement and data collection, like what you measure determines what comes out. And if you're biased in your selection of your sample and how you measure things, or what you exclude from your study, that will affect your results. And that's not a bias in the process, that's a bias in the researcher. To me, these things are self-evident. So I guess it's kind of the difference between having a really deep experience of philosophy and the idea of how we construct things, how we even operationalize a concept, which is, again, in the natural sciences, you're just oh, this is 1 liter, blah, blah, blah. That's, honestly, it's elementary level stuff. But when you want to measure something like democracy, yeah, it gets harder, and you have to think more. I got patience. Yes, I do. All right. So, coming back to this nonsense.
A scientific model is taken to be informed by the values that are held by the scientists who develop it, which...
Again, who said this? I don't know who said these things. So, without quotes, you go, oh, it's in a book. No, I'm not going to go oh, it's like the Jordan Peterson. Oh, you have to read every single book I've read in order to criticize me. No, I don't. If you don't put your evidence up on the screen, you are happy to go on at length about science that has nothing to do with this. So at least if you're going to make accusations as to what other people do, think, and say, quote them saying it.
Which in turn are determined by which demographics those scientists belong to.
Again, I don't see any evidence of this. Here, again, another this sort of braiding indigenous science with Western science, and they talk about how students learn. This isn't calling, so what he puts on the screen does not support what he says. But you don't spend the time actually reading everything on his screen. Your eyes are drawn down to whatever he highlights. And so this is a manipulative way of taking things out of context and falsely presenting them.
What this implies is the existence of a plurality of sciences, each particular to the demographic that partakes in the scientific activity.
All right, honestly, I've been a social scientist, a practicing social scientist. Well, my first publication was in 2005. I've never gone to a conference and seen either qualitative or quantitative researchers who said this. So again, who's saying these things? You can't show this. So you're not convincing me. And especially when you apply it to all social constructionists, it's just completely false.
Because the science that has been given institutional legitimacy was historically developed by straight white men, the values that have shaped scientific conclusions have reflected that.
Hello, did we talk about Tuskegee? You think this would have happened if there were human equality in how if there were Black doctors and other color, other people of color in those labs, you think that they wouldn't just step up and go, hey, maybe we shouldn't use other human beings as lab rats. Maybe you shouldn't use people who look like me as a lab rat and just let their syphilis go untreated. Maybe if there were, like half the team was women and women in the scientists in the lab, and some guy piped up and said, let's just exclude all women. Maybe people in the room, women in the room would say, hey, well, look, you're going to give the treatment to people like me, right? Well, shouldn't we know its long-term impacts on people like me too? If we're going to do it that way, why not do the harder stuff? Because women are, with their hormone fluctuations are more complicated. Let's have a whole study of women and then take that as the basis. Because, men are, we'll tack them on. That's a value statement. And that gets smuggled into science as being objective. That is the critique. Not that science is bad, but when you smuggle in these kinds of attitudes, then science is no longer objective. Science is actually being set up to reinforce a power structure or an inadequacy that already exists, and you're trying to reinforce it. So be reflective of that. Unpack that. Think about how you could, because ultimately what the social constructionist like me wants to do is better science. We want to have better science. We want to have science that is more inclusive of people's medical needs and is more ethical. And we can also think about it from not only the medical sciences, but economics, right? Economics is done in the West primarily from a capitalist point of view, but that assumes that the best thing you can do is make money, right? Money is considered like the thing that is valued. What if instead you had an entire perspective that was doing a study of economics, but from the goal of full employment? Like, how close are we to full employment? What are the barriers to full employment? Now, none of your maths will change. None of your unemployment data will change. But your perspective on what the object of inquiry is and what the solution to that is. That's, and economics uses a lot of statistics and a lot of theories and a lot of maths. They want to be rigorous, but that doesn't mean that there aren't values being smuggled into those studies.
Producing a science which has legitimated practices that benefit straight white men at the expense of everybody else.
Because was it white straight men in those Tuskegee experiments? Was it straight white men being experimented on by the Nazis? Again, just even acknowledging any of this critique here would have been helpful. But the whole point of this, we shouldn't lose sight. And again, this is why the whole blinding you with science. None of this disproves that science is a social construct. None of this accusations and straw men arguing, all this sort of here's the problem with social constructionism, gets to the question, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be considered a social construct? What are the properties of science? Does science meet or not the required properties, the necessary and sufficient conditions of being considered a social construct? That's all this video had to be. It could have been a 5-minute video. Instead, he's going down cherry picking all this kind of stuff because he wants to do blah, 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 magic, blind you with all these terms and accusations, and it shows the weakness of his position.
Therefore, allowing for a plurality of culturally specific sciences will permit not only an expansion of scientific knowledge, but the legitimation of truths which serve the group interests of other demographics.
Again, quoting nobody. Quoting absolutely nobody. Doing a feminist scientific, doing feminist science is about the critique. Now, one of the early feminist critiques of the way that science was being done is that it treated human subjects like lab rats. And this is a valid critique of behaviorism. When, let's say there's a lot of experiments that are done in psychology, has a lot of very deep experimental tradition. Also, in political science, we do experiments, computer experiments showing people things, or even in-person experiments. The thing about this perspective, coming from the natural sciences, is that it tends to see people as objects that we provide a stimuli and we measure their response. So you bring someone in and you do an experiment and you have a control group and you give this person this stimuli and you watch their response and then you interpret their response. And then you do another one, right? And the critique of this is that you're not actually dealing with the human being. This was the start of the development of qualitative research, which is instead of just bringing people in and showing them a stimuli and having them press a button or make a, do a dial or fill out a survey, whatever it is, you ask them about their experience of that phenomenon and you try to understand where they're coming from and what they're thinking about. But to do that, you have to see them as a person, not as a thing that you poke with a stick to see what it does. And so these kinds of ethical and epistemological critiques are good for science. They advance science. They give us different ways of learning. So I laughed at spirit science. You don't even know what that is.
Science, according to social constructionists, is ultimately politics by other means.
Now, here he's got a quote, but he doesn't define what politics is. Right? And this, again, is getting to... It's more of this sort of trying to dazzle you with a whole bunch of words and phrases that he's not spent time defining. There's a very famous phrase, politics is who gets what, why, and how. Politics is, now again, we don't even know where this, let's take a look at what this is to see where this is coming from, because I don't even know that this is actually related to social constructionism that much at all. Science is politics by other means, and it also generates reliable information about the empirical world. Oh my gosh, look at that. They're saying that. No wonder he didn't continue that quote. That goes against what he's trying to sell off here, right? Science is more than politics, of course, but it is that. Yeah, right. Science, who gets what, why, and how. What questions get asked? What questions get answered? What research gets funded? Is a question of who gets what, when, and how. And if you have certain groups of people dominating inside a discipline, let's say straight white males, then the questions being asked will reflect their worldview, because that's the worldview they have. Now, this person is saying science generates reliable information about the empirical world. It's more than politics, but there is politics in science. I don't think that's a really controversial statement. If you've ever applied for funding for research, you know that science is politics. You have to know what the group wants to fund. It is a contested terrain and has been so from its origins. Groups with conflicting social agendas have to struggle to gain control of the social resources that the sciences, their information, their technologies, and their prestige can provide. Yeah, grant competitions. This happens all the time. And value judgments are made within science as to what gets funded all the time. For those who have suffered from what seems to be the consequences of sciences, their technologies, and their forms of rationality, it appears absurd to regard science as the value-free, disinterested, impartial, Archimedean arbiter. This is the issue, the arbiter of conflicting agendas as conventional mythology holds. This is an entirely valid critique. I know, for instance, I had a piece that we had got published eventually in Parliamentary Affairs. But initially when we sent it out, it was based on focus groups, right? So it was empirical. We went out to the world, we talked to people, we collected our data, we thematized our data in an open and transparent way so that anyone could go and look at our transcripts or our analysis and try to replicate our work. And from that, we found patterns in the way people across England, Scotland, and Wales talked about political issues. And our article was describing that. It was a descriptive piece, because qualitative research can't do inferential statistics, but it can be a form of generating theories. And how do you generate theories? You start from observations. You do inductive reasoning in order to get to a theory that you can then deductively apply. And we had a reviewer who wrote back saying, there's nothing you can conclude from focus group data, so reject this article. And I just thought, well, you should have disqualified yourself from reviewing this because you don't understand my approach or my methodology or my criteria for data. You're just saying, I don't like the way you did this, therefore don't publish it. Now, that is a way and eventually, like I said, we did get it. It's available in Parliamentary Affairs. It's open access. I went with what I always did, an analysis of Clegmania. This is gatekeeping, right? This is a quantitative person who's used to who's used to data sets, who's used to hypothesis statements and rejecting the null hypothesis and all this kind of stuff, not understanding a different way of doing inductive theory generation based on observation and triangulation of data. That's politics. That's not science. And that happens all the time. There's a lot of gatekeeping. You can see it in academic journals that theories that findings that uphold common or popular theories get published more often than papers that don't reinforce that theory. There's human selection bias in what makes it through peer review. There's also a tendency to go for articles that have statistically significant findings, which overemphasizes that part of it. Like, if you do a whole study and you get null results, you get like null findings in your model, you're gonna have a really hard time getting that published, which is why there's a journal of null results or something like that. Journal of not multivariate analysis. I can't remember the name of it now. Yeah, the Journal of Null Findings. Someone had to start this international journal of negative and null results because there was such a bias in the existing journal structure toward things that had a positive result or reinforced the theory. So that's another way that science is politics. What gets published? So the International Journal of Negative Null Results is a peer-reviewed open access science journal that publishes original research papers, articles, essays, specifically focused on experiments that produced no positive results. Recognizing that negative results often go unpublished but represent valuable information to other investigators, the aim of this journal is to become a primary repository for negative and null results studies within all areas of science. Yeah, science is politics. I've been going, I have to take another break, guys. I'm sorry. I feel, it's hard to get through this video by King Crocoduck because there's just so much to object to, and there's so much deception, misrepresentation, and there's so many logical fallacies and assertions without evidence, quotes without sources, accusations but no proof. That is difficult. So, all right, I need to take another break, guys. Sorry. I will try to get through more of this, but this is why I was a little bit exhausted after doing 2 hours of a video last time. There's just so much garbage in here, and the problem is none of this garbage has anything to do with his main thesis, which is that science is not a social construct. And yet we're 16 minutes in and he's not demonstrated that at all. If anything, he's just said science is socially constructed because science happens in a society. So yeah, they're all right. It's a truism. Well, that's hardly an argument against it being a social construct. All right, gonna pause again. Sorry, and come back. I only need 2 minutes this time. And my coffee, I'm gonna not have any more coffee, but I do need to take a break. So let's do that. All right, catch you guys in just a little, like 2 minutes. And I'm back. The thing is, like, I didn't even make it, guys. Like, I actually made it to, like, minute, I don't know, 19. Oh no, 16:23. This is the first, I've gotten this far twice today. Alrighty-dighty. Okay, so I'm gonna go over this a little bit. And a little bit more, but then I really want to get to how to write an essay. Because I think that there's really no point in going through these straw man after straw man. I will, though, one thing, call out the obvious sexism of King Crocoduck. He uses basically no pronouns for anybody in any of this video. And yet when he characterizes the social constructionist, he uses the pronoun her. And I think this just shows, it smacks of his sexism, or at least his pandering to sexism. It's women who do this. The social constructionists are women, and they don't know how to do science. And it's really vile. So, I'm interested, I want to say a little bit what Rusty Worth says here, just because they've had some interesting, well, I mean, they've got a very sort of I want to say again, naive realist perspective on science. So we can erase all the measurement and just pick the length of my middle finger as a basic unit. All the laws will stay the same. I don't think that you quite understand, Rusty. You're thinking very limited in a very narrow way in terms of science only being embedded in something like physics or chemistry. And you have to widen out your view to understand that the process that science, the process of science is applicable to any object of knowledge. Therefore, just because a critique isn't necessarily related to one specific practice in a scientific sub-discipline, that doesn't mean it's not valid in other disciplines. So a measurement issue, like measurement validity and construct validity, are not as important of an issue inside, let's say, chemistry or physics. But that doesn't mean it's not an issue for other parts of the scientific world. So to dismiss the question because it doesn't apply to you just kind of shows a navel-gazing approach to knowledge production. You need to think more widely about science as a process. And here's the other thing. If the critique doesn't apply to your discipline, then why are you offended? It's like, like when Black people or people of color talk about racist white people, I don't get offended because they're not talking about me. And they're valid, their critiques are valid for the people they are talking about. So maybe don't make it all about you, Rust. Maybe think about, well, I don't see how that necessarily, like, the question of measurement validity isn't something that I deal with, therefore it's not a good question. Like, no, it's for a lot of other people, measurement validity, construct validity, these are all things that do take up time and thought. So, like, maybe think about science in a more broad sense of knowledge production, as opposed to the narrow corner of the world in which you do science. Social science is not a science at all. So, this is a very interesting, like, it makes me understand that people in the natural sciences don't understand what science is. Science isn't determined by the object of inquiry. What determines whether or not an endeavor is scientific is the approach you use to investigate it. And so if in the social sciences we have a theory, let's say we're taking rational choice theory. By the way, you're saying that economics isn't a science, even though it relies entirely on econometrics and statistics and data. Reconcile that. Right, so if I have a theory about rational choice that says that people will pursue the greatest utility by estimating the costs multiplied by the possibility of the benefits of an activity, and I can operationalize those costs, and I can operationalize the probability of a benefit, and I can do the sums, and I can say, in my model, people who have lower costs will be, let's say, more likely to vote, and people who have higher costs and so people who have lower costs and live in constituencies or districts that are closer, the races are very close and competitive, will be more motivated to go out and vote because they'll see more efficacy in their vote choice than people who live in a very safe district or where there's not even a race, and there's a high cost to getting information. They're going to have a lower probability to vote. And I test that with my falsifiable hypothesis. The null hypothesis would say we'd see no difference in these measurements, and the effects of the sign, the significance of the coefficients in the models should not, the null hypothesis is no difference regardless of those factors, and the other one is a test of each element about the cost and the closeness of the race, everything else. You're saying that's not science, even though it has a theory, operationalization, measurement, hypotheses, specific cutoff points for when a result is considered valid or not based on widely accepted statistical theory, and then we have our observable evidence in the form of surveys, and we look at our data and we do our analysis. That's not science? Why? Because it's studying people? That's just ridiculous. You have to think about, again, people in the natural sciences don't tend to have a very good philosophical grasp of what it means to do science, which is to produce knowledge. So, yeah, this is, again, very navel-gazing, also a very naive realist perspective on it. And I guess it's, the luxury of the natural sciences that things appear self-evident, so they don't have to think very hard. You get real lazy thinking. You just get accepting what was taught to you and handed down century after century. Whereas the question of democracy has to be reinvented. Like, what is democracy and how do we measure it? It's a challenge that lasts across generations, because what democracy was to the ancient Greeks isn't what democracy meant to the founders, and it's not what we mean today. So we're constantly being challenged on understanding the current use of the concepts and words that we use in the social sciences. So we have to be much more rigorous in our thought process. We have to be much more thoughtful in the way we construct not only our definitions, but our operationalizations, and make sure we're explicitly linking these things to our measurements. Now, I don't even know if a natural science person would know what operationalizing means, because they just use the measurements that are handed down. So, Rustworth, if you want strawmen, I would say that you should check out King Crocoduck's making accusations and characterizing what people say without evidence, as opposed to looking at the fact that, a leader is a leader is a leader. Y'all don't question that. You just kind of move on. Therefore, you don't have the kinds of philosophical challenges. You don't have to do the kind of philosophical rigor that we do in the social sciences.
This view of the scientific enterprise stands or falls on whether socially specific background values do indeed have a non-negligible impact on scientific models.
And again, this is I don't understand, one, where he's talking about, who said these things. And two, as I've shown in the medical studies, that's a natural science. That's a STEM thing, right? We do see these values being smuggled in, either sexism or racism. So the fact that those things happened aren't contestable. So I'm not quite, what is the, I don't understand why he's objecting to these. Maybe he hasn't thought about it very much.
And so the entire field of science and technology studies, or STS, is dedicated to the exposure of how socially situated bias has influenced the development of scientific theories.
So again, I think this is a problem with the narrowness of King Crocoduck's view of science and experience of science. As a political scientist, I work with theories from sociology, because I was interested in the studies of the measurement of sex and gender in the social sciences. I did have to go to biology, and I had to look at brain studies, and I had to look at studies of childhood interests, and when kids develop interest in politics and at what ages they use it. I've had to use econometrics and economic theories. Rational choice theory is an example of one, to account for observed differences in the aggregate vote between men and women in a sort of cis-normative dichotomy and the aggregate that we often use in the social sciences. So, you know, I think if you don't see things more broadly, then it is difficult for you to see the applicability of a valid critique just because of your navel gazing. You have to think a bit more broadly about science.
STS theorists will tirelessly publish strategies for creating a new science that takes a plurality of socially situated biases into account.
So feminist science is a critique of science from a feminist perspective. Like, there isn't a school of feminist science. There isn't a school of, like, African American science. Like, I don't understand, like, again, these straw people being put up. He is big mad. He is big mad. There's a lot of accusations of what people think, and yet, when you look at what is said here, it's not about inventing specific sciences for different groups. The question that Longino is asking is, while we can use these models to expose masculine and other forms of bias, we can also use them to defend the introduction of assumptions grounded in feminist political values. Well, what are those values? Things such as, maybe don't treat people like lab rats. Maybe be aware of the sexist biases that you're smuggling into your research. Maybe think about the implications of medical treatments that were designed for men, maybe not being as effective or at all applicable to women's bodies or people who are on or taking hormones, you know, for trans people. That's what we're talking about. It's not about, like, feminist science is going to have its own version of the null hypothesis. I think it's a misunderstanding of what these critiques are really getting at.
All the while trying to imbue science with a set of background values that will orient the models in a manner deemed desirable by such theorists.
But here's the thing, he's not acknowledging the racism and the sexism that existed in the scientific practices that cause the reaction of critique. If science hadn't, you know, valued men's health and men's bodies over women's for the justification of simplicity over accuracy, then you wouldn't need the feminist critique. If white men in the labs had valued African American men as much as they valued white men, they would never have put them through those scientific tests. Right? Acknowledging that scientific racism and scientific sexism exist would go a long way to at least positioning himself in a way to say, okay, there are some valid critiques on this side, but then these individuals over here. And yet we don't get at the end, he sort of like lists some people, but he doesn't sort of specifically quote them or set them up as the face of this, you know, like, here's a person who I can quote again and again, and here are their videos. None of that. This is a very, very, like, this is not a very good essay. It doesn't do very good argumentation. I'm going to let this run. This is why I didn't want to sit and do this in the last. There's so much wrong here. There's so much bad that it gets exhausting. And again, the important point that I keep coming back to, asking if there can be a feminist science has nothing to do with whether or not science is a social construct, which it is. And he never proves that it's not. So, yes, a feminist approach simply seeks to neutralize bias, exactly. I mean, if you're not aware of something, then you can't take care of it. But if you go in pointing out, boy, there's a real sexist approach to here, and then all of the guys go, I'm not sexist, I'm offended, then you're just reproducing the sexism. You're not actually addressing it.
They do not see science as our best means of approximating the truth.
Who? I do social constructionism. That is not at all my position. Who is they? Who is the mysterious they? Here, science that earned its epistemic authority through its co-constitution with colonialization and slavery. In highlighting this bit doesn't substantiate your previous claim. So, I argue that passion for science may act to strengthen the relationship between science and truth, and conversely, willfully refuse and failure to break down. I offer critical science literacy as a practice that can directly challenge the epistemic authority of science and be read as doing science more broadly as rewriting knowledge. Again, this doesn't substantiate the kinds of claims he's making. And also, I don't even know, this abstract could be a working paper presented at a conference. So without any information here, It's very deceptive to selectively highlight lines without really giving the other person's perspective their kind of just due. I'm going through and I'm letting King Crocoduck speak for himself, and then I am refuting it. What I'm not doing is just looking at a picture of his video and trash talking him. And that's what I would like to see more of here. Actually, give examples of what you're talking about, and mostly give examples of how science is not a social construct, because that's your main argument. All right.
But merely as a means of legitimating those practices that serve the class interests of whoever partakes in the activity.
And nothing about that is in here. It's nothing here about class or anything. So again, it's smoke and mirrors. It's not argumentation.
The goal is to ultimately create a set of emancipatory sciences which, by representing the interests of those who are not in power,
Lessons on white privilege isn't the creation of an emancipatory... what do you mean by the creation of an emancipatory science? Are you talking about science that is practiced without sexism and racism? Because this high school physics includes lessons on white privilege, isn't that? So what are you talking about here? And also, if you really object to the idea of a science that is self-aware of its capacity for sexism and racism and other kinds of biases that are going to get smuggled in and therefore distort the results or the findings because of the assumptions going into it, well, don't you want to identify those and remove those?
will serve to legitimate those practices that result in a more equal and fair society.
So you see, this is what it's really getting at: the white dude, the white privileged dude, victimization. All these social constructionists just want to make everyone the same. Unsupported. Not quoting anyone. All right, so we're getting on to 2 hours, and I'm sorry it's taken so long. It's so hard to, it takes so long to unpack this crap and explain on how many levels it's not good. So let me go over very quickly. What do you need to do in this essay, King Crocoduck? All right, an essay should always address 4 fundamental things. You should always have, what is my question? Here your question is science a social construct? Right? And you do sort of clearly state that, but then you lose the thread. You lose focus. So the next part that you have to have inside your essay, video essay, your period, whatever you're going to write, okay? What is my answer? The answer isn't just yes or no, right? It's not, is science a social construct? No, that's not an answer. Your answer is an explanation, right? Social constructs can be defined as having the following necessary properties, and here are also listed the sufficient properties that can be used based on this person published in this year and this person published on this year. We can triangulate to get this approximation of these are the fundamental characteristics of a social construct. What is science? And then define science. You can do a couple different definitions. You can find out its necessary and sufficient properties. For instance, qualitative research, to me, is not scientific because it lacks falsifiability. It is primarily there for theory generation. It is an inductive process based on observation in order to identify patterns that can then be thought about and developed into a generalizable rule that can be tested as a theory. All right, so qualitative research, you can go, that's not science, but over here we have quantitative research, and this meets all of the definitions of what a scientific process is because it does X, Y, and Z. Right, and so if you say, okay, here's how we do science, here are the components, and then we map on the relevant things. So what is my question? What is my answer? And then why should you believe me? Why should you believe me? Maybe your grounds for belief come from setting up a chart of all of the characteristics of a social construct and all of the characteristics of the scientific process and measuring, checking off which ones they have in common. And you say, well, if it isn't 100%, then it's not a social construct. Now, that's a pretty weak argument. You say if it's, it maybe shares 2 elements. I mean, it'll share more. But whatever it is, you can't just say, these people are bad, I don't like them, therefore believe me. That doesn't work. You have to demonstrate why people should believe you. So what is my question? What is my answer? Why should you believe me, and why should you care? Why is this issue important? Now, for King Crocoduck, this issue is important because these uppity women, these uppity people of color, these uppity indigenous people, all want to question the truth of science. And he finds that apparently very threatening. And I think he finds that threatening because he doesn't think of science outside of his little worldview. And again, as social scientists, we have to apply the scientific method to human beings, their behaviors, what they report to be their beliefs, their attitudes, their values, and also we have to incorporate things from the natural sciences. Political science is, it was kind of a fashion. I think it's sort of fallen out of fashion because the findings were so minuscule and unimportant. But for a little while there was a lot of study into the genetic links. Like, can we find our politics in our genes? Is there something genetically that maybe leads on to a sort of phenotype development of how our brains react? We know, for instance, from psychology that people with higher levels of disgust responses are more conservative. If you see a picture of like a wound with maggots in it, people who are politically right are more likely to find that emotionally upsetting. Whereas people who are more on the left side of the political spectrum, they'll see it and they'll be disturbed by it, but they won't quite be as shocked. And the idea here is that a biological fear response, makes people more conservative because they're in a more defensive position. Whereas because the physiological responses of people with more left-wing or liberal views isn't quite as intense, they feel a more tolerance toward it, right? And so the idea here is that maybe there's something in the genes that links with the expression of those genes in our physiology that then sort of primes us to be more likely to be politically left or politically right. And the way that they tested this in political science was through twin studies. They used the Minnesota database of 800 twin samples, some fraternal, some identical, some twins who had grown up in the same family, other twins who had been separated. Now, there's a problem with generalizability in these kind of twin studies because you're looking only at twins. But in terms of comparison, like, is it environmental? Is it biological? What parts of people's political attitudes could be explained by the other factors besides their biology? So the idea that the social sciences aren't scientific is seriously is ridiculous if you know anything about the work being done in the social sciences, because we draw on the natural sciences as well as other scientific practices all the time. It's the people in the natural sciences often who live in a little world of natural science where everything is pretty self-evident and not really questioned, and new information comes up, but they don't engage in the kind of cross-disciplinary work that comes through the social sciences. Their understanding ends up being a little bit stunted, and then they take offense rather because they don't understand the critiques being from the perspective that they're being made. So what is my question? What is my answer? Why should you believe me, and why should you care? Why should we care whether or not science is a social construct? That, other than the fact that people are offended at the idea that King Crocoduck is offended at the idea that it's a social construct, he doesn't make an argument for why you should care. Now, I would make an argument that you should care about science being a social construct because then you realize that it's like other human endeavors, it's fallible. And that therefore we have to take its results tentatively and be open to the possibility that there are errors or biases in there that we need to correct for and that new knowledge might be produced. It's just a tentative approach. It is an approach that is willing to criticize the process instead of putting it up on an altar. Scientific process is a human construct. We made it up. We decide what constitutes, a falsifiable statement. We decide what constitutes statistically significant results. There's a lot of roles of values. We decide that a parsimonious value is, parsimonious model is preferable based on aesthetics and efficiencies. But those are things that are values. So science is value laden from start to finish. And it mostly is driven by the fact that we value what we consider like this standard of valid knowledge. All of that is value-based. So the idea that science is objective and value-free and neutral is simply, I get, like, it's a very naive perspective. And it's one that we're probably, like, I don't want to, like, it's naive because we're taught in a way, I think science is often taught in a very simplified way. That science is taught as like a truth giver. And when you look under the hood, when you, instead of looking at here are the things that science produces and these are facts, you look at the philosophy that underpins it. The philosophy is a lot more tentative. Philosophy is a lot more it does a better job of acknowledging the human role in all of these things. And to try to say, oh, science produces objective knowledge is a way to, it's trying to, like, checkmate. I've been binging a lot of chess videos. I'm learning how to play chess through videos. It's an attempt to sort of like checkmate, people. Like, I have an objective truth. You can't touch this. And the problem with that is that objective truth is really underpinned by a whole bunch of subjective things. Science needs to be consistent with the world. Well, yeah, I mean, that's correspondence theory. Science builds knowledge from philosophy. Philosophy doesn't just build from, oh God, Rust. You don't understand the philosophy of science. Just you're gonna find this offensive. But you're really looking at science from a process situation. You're not looking at it from starting principles. Go back to Hume. Go read Comte. Go read Mill. Go read, Kuhn. You can also read Chambers. What is science? There's a lot of good resources on the philosophy of science, because science itself has been under development, and what it has meant has changed over time. The kind of science practiced by, let's say, Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, is an attempt to be scientific about the economy, right? Like, they didn't have falsification, so is it not science? Newton didn't have falsification. Is that not science? And so, I know you think I bet you're really good at knowing what to do in a lab, Rust. I bet you've got all the check marks on first I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this. But where did that checklist come from? Who made it up? Who decided that was the right way to produce knowledge? We did, which means it's a social construct. All right. So, yes, so apparently, like I said, King Crocoduck now is motivated to challenge me on my knowledge of statistics, even though I literally taught them for research methods in the quantitative social sciences, and taught people the statistical package SPSS. I'll be learning, by the way, I have gotten away from more statistical based pieces, even though I've been working with data and harmonizing concepts in big data sets. But yeah, I don't know how to do science. The arrogance of the person who doesn't understand the topic as well as they think they do. I know what truth is. What's truth? Ooh. Okay. This has been, it's been kind of exhausting. And we've only gotten through 4 minutes. We're not going to do anymore. If you want to watch the rest of the King Crocoduck video, the primary thing I keep coming back to is this whole part of the video. None of this demonstrates science is not a social construct. It's all hand waving and logical fallacies. And at the end of the day, I think that their conclusion is, don't accept that when people say science is a social construct because they're bad people. Is pretty much. That's pretty much the biggest argument that King Crocoduck has is an ad hominem. Like, don't believe these people because they're suspect. Not actually defining social construct and comparing it to the definition of science. So I guess, we'll see. King Crocoduck is probably going to do some sort of hit piece on me. And all of it will be in aid of avoiding admitting that he's never defined a social construct in this video. So look forward to that in 2021. All right, I've got 5 hours, I think it is, doing the maths right, till my next D&D session. So I'm going to go chill. And I'm going to do a little bit of game prep and enjoy the rest of the day. I hope you guys have a good rest of your Sunday. Next Sunday, I will not be talking about King Crocoduck anymore. But if people want, maybe we could look at... there are some pretty enjoyable videos out there. Some of them are kind of old school. But let me try and... I think it's spelled like this. No, that's not what I wanted. Okay, let me go to YouTube first. Oh, I'm already on YouTube. All right. So, I would strongly recommend, if people like this content... I can't spell. Philosophy of Science. Yeah, this is a good one. The Philosophy of Science with Hilary Putnam. I really like. I'm a big fan of these old school BBC discussions of science. Of philosophy. I would strongly recommend that people go and watch basically any of this. There's one with a very young John Searle here on the philosophy of language. There's one with A.J. Ayres, who knew the logical positivists and like hung out with them. I think that one is also about the philosophy of language, although it might be the philosophy of science. Wittgenstein. If you want to talk about someone who moved from a logical positivist to really being a critic of the logical positives, then you have to look at Wittgenstein and the Tractatus and the other philosophical investigations, and really the journey that Wittgenstein made over the course of his life when it came to understanding the role of language and how it actually functions. So there's a lot of really these good philosophy, old school BBC, white guy dominated, because that was how philosophy was done, talks though. And I mean, the content of the talks is so fascinating, even if they're not great on representation. But so I would strongly recommend that, and as enjoyable. And maybe we can take certain parts of this and look at this further next week. All right, I'm getting all nerdy on my channel. It's just nice to not have to talk about Trump and fascism. Croc claimed D&D isn't a social construct. Yes. All right, so yeah, let's go ahead and let's maybe turn this into a mini philosophy of science discussion, and we can get into some of the ideas underpinning it. And also, I think what's really good to do is to look at the evolution of what science was, what it was considered and how it was practiced and how it developed over time, because it so much is a social construct created by humans. I mean, before Popper, you didn't have falsifiability. So was science before falsifiability not science? Well, no, but it was just like a poor version of science. Yeah, like science was improved through the theory of, or the concept of falsifiability. All right. I'm going to start talking. I'm going to stop talking, and then I don't stop talking. But anyways, thanks you guys for sticking with me for all my breaks. And also all of the little alleyways, all the gasa that we went down. And until next time, I've been Christy. You've been awesome. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And join me next Sunday when we're going to get nerdy with it some more. Okay, it's done. See you later. Goodbye, wherever and whenever it is that you are. Okay, that's what I say. All right, bye.